Special thanks to all the sponsors of the Myth Information Conference 3 in October. Author of the new book, Mythos Christos, Edwin Herbert, Atheist Republic, Godless Engineer, Kenosha Racine Area Freethinkers, Atheist Community of Milwaukee, Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Sophia Wolf Quadracci Memorial Fund for Stem Cell Research. And please remember that your purchase of a $300 sponsorship table for the event includes 1 ticket to the conference and 1 ticket to the VIP party, and also gets you mentions on all of our social media platforms as well as this podcast. And a very special shout out and thank you to all of our patrons who support the show. Welcome back live. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Mythicist Milwaukee Show, keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. I'm your host, Rob Moore, the Deacon of Doubt. With me, as always, is there's white smoke in my chimney today. I have, in fact, my Council of One has appointed my co-host, the Pope of Apostasy, today. He is, you can get your mind around that alliterative title for a moment. Congratulations, Pope. It's Brian Edwards. What's going on, man?
Did I get upgraded from the friar?
Just for the day. Don't get big for your britches.
Oh, a small conclave, and I've been elected. Okay,
there needed to be an emergency council last night for reasons untold, but yes, you are for today the Pope of Apostasy, having quit every other religion.
I'll take it. At least I'm a pope and not an anti-pope.
How did you enjoy the Free Thought Festival, my friend?
I did. I enjoyed it. We hung out with Faisal, Saeed Al-Mukhtar, James Randi did a heck of a card trick.
Right up front, man. We were right there with him. It was fantastic. It couldn't have been any closer, and he wowed the crowd with a card trick. How was yesterday? I was not in attendance. Was it good?
It was. We interviewed Faisal for ourselves, so that was kind of fun. So we didn't get to see as much of the conference as we'd liked, but
we speak, of course, of Free Thought Festival in Madison, Wisconsin, long a hotbed of liberal and secular thought, and the home to FFRF, and of course the students at UWM. It's an AHA thing. I don't even want to get it wrong. Atheists, Humanists, and Agnostics at the University. Whoa, I got it right. I'm getting a thumbs up at the University of Madison, and we want to make sure that we shout out to everyone that we talked to at that great event. You have a list for us of people, or is this a general?
We spoke to Taylor, one of the organizers there. He was a sophomore.
Who else did you see besides Faisal, Taylor?
As far as speakers?
Who else did you network with? You guys talked to a lot of people.
We did. Those are the ones we remember.
Tom Leeds was there.
Tom
Leeds
was there.
We saw folks from the Chicago circle in general.
All the Madison Skeptics group.
All the Madison Skeptics group. It was a great crew. Of course, FFRF sponsored as well as the AHA and other groups too. So,
right. And Gotham and Katie, who are the kind of the leaders of the Buddhist movement over there.
And they got Eugenie Scott. They got Eugenie Scott to come out, who was fascinating. Her talk was fascinating. It was really to the point on how the bills get introduced across the country and how they kind of mimic each other. And she pulled together a family tree sort of language that goes into bills to introduce creationism into the school curriculum, of course, which is a pet peeve of mine and a pet project of Crafts. But enough about that. You guys had a good time in Madison. We could talk about that all day, and we've got more and more irons in the fire. But today, we have a guest. What do you know about him?
What do we know about our guest today?
John Lundwall.
You want me to do?
That's all right.
He's flipping it over to me. I guess the Pope of Apostasy has to take over sometimes, and use my papal authority and my omniscience.
Please do.
It's not omniscience.
Issue a bull.
It's papal infallibility. Sorry. So John K. Lundwall received his BA in English Literature from Brigham Young University, his master's and PhD in Mythological Studies from Pacifica Graduate Institute in California. Dr. Lundwall has presented numerous lectures at symposiums, conferences, and public classes in myth studies, and has received and has served as an editor for several publications. He specializes in connections between cosmology, myth, and cults. His book, Myth and the Cosmos, The Meaning in the Oral Age, reexamines ancient myth through the template of oral thinking and oral cosmology, contradicting decades of assumptions about the purpose and function of ancient mythology. Lundwall defines myth as the oral imprinting press of pre-literate peoples. I really like that.
Nice. Well done.
And shows that myth belongs to a complex and rational method of information transmission amongst oral peoples.
Welcome, John Lundwall. You there?
I am here. Thank you. I have never spoken to a pope let alone a Pope of Apostasy. So I'm quite honored.
You see, I already did good, didn't I?
Bless you, my child.
Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
You bet. You bet. Now, just tell me, with the Pope of Apostasy, how much infallibility is involved?
Well, right now I'm going to use the Francis defense, and that I'm not speaking with infallibility, so I can kind of say whatever I want.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Well done.
I do that all the time.
I'm speaking ex cathedra.
You're an English literature guy, and you can tell right by that phrase there, the oral imprinting press of pre-literate peoples. I'm a fan of alliteration, and as the people around me are probably annoyed because I can't stay away from it. I absolutely love it, and that's a beautiful phrase. But I want to start right at the beginning. That seems obvious to me, and maybe I sound like a jerk for saying that, but I always thought that everybody knew that mythology was the oral tradition of pre-literate peoples, and that was how the stories were told, and your cultural tradition was passed on, so that the story could, in essence, be told without a lot of changes, and people could memorize the basic structure. I thought that was sort of well known. So tell us, John, what are the decade-old assumptions that came before that?
Well, see, fortunately, you haven't been through the years of academia reading all the theories, which have so diluted the obvious that well, truly, when I begin a presentation, I always begin with asking people, try to imagine a world where there is no writing.
That's hard.
And that is hard. It's a permanent epistemological divide. We cannot recover the oral world. But oral thinking structures thought. And, one of the big mistakes we make is we believe everyone in the ancient past were a bunch of primitive howling barbarians all sitting around in a cave waiting for someone to come up with a thought. That's not what they ancient peoples were. They were just as smart as we are, but they were running on slightly different software, same hardware, different software, and that software was orality. How do you pass down complex information with no writing? How do you pass down a calendar? How do you pass down your traditions, your technological traditions? How do you do that? Well, mythology is part of it. It's the oral imprinting press, as I say. And of course, I'm using a literate metaphor by calling it a printing press, and already that's problematic because orality and literacy are completely two different cognitive structures. So just briefly, I'll tell you what this imprinting press was in oral cultures as best as we can understand it. And it turns out to be a series of layers of ways to remember information that reinforce each other. And there are four principal layers that oral cultures use to keep their memories. One is a narrative template. That would be myths, the stories they tell. And those stories have to be memorable stories. So they're always full of big characters and outrageous events and gods copulating with everything. That serves the mnemonic requirements of memory. The second thing oral cultures embed with their myths is rituals. And in fact, a myth is really just a narrative recitation of a ritual. A ritual is a action of a repetition of a narrative, a myth. The third thing they use is sacred space. So their temples, their groves, their caves, all of which have embedded in it the same meaning where they perform their rituals and tell their stories. And all of this is underwritten by a cosmology. And this is the important point that is often overlooked. And that is when all of this is encoded into nature, especially the stars overhead. So when a certain star rises on the horizon, that tells the oral culture, okay, now is the time to perform this rite at this space and tell this story, so that the star, the sun, the story, the ritual, the sacred space are all intermingled. And that's how they pass down their information. It's a series of reinforcements. Did I lose you?
No, we're here because I want you
We're
to
digesting.
I want you to go ahead and enlighten us, since you trudged through the morass of academia to get to this information. What were the decade-old assumption? What did people really think? Before the obvious.
It's 3 years of coursework for the doctoral studies. Took me 5 years to write my dissertation. And all that time, I never, I shouldn't say never, I'd say 95% of the time, none of the academics ever talked about the cosmology of oral cultures. This is such a shocking absence of how oral cultures operate. That so you look at James Fraser. He's a big name. You may have heard it. He wrote this big multi-volume series called The Golden Bough, and all myths can be explained, according to Fraser, through fertility rites and through agricultural processes. So all gods are a version of a corn god or a fertility god or goddess. So there's that school of thought. You've got the psychological school of thought of Freud and Jung, who, Freud, all gods were penises and all goddesses were vaginas. And Jung, it's all subconscious, sort of this evolutionary paradigm that primitive peoples hadn't developed consciousness as fully as we have. And so the myths emerged from the subconscious. So you get these various academic schools of thought. You have the structuralist, the Levi-Strauss crowd that talks about myth as a way to talk about the opposite tensions in culture and society.
Right.
So it goes on and on and on. You get Walter Burkett, the classicist, who sometimes talk about ritual, but what happens is after a while of reading all these different theories, you realize that all these different theories are modern suppositions projected into the past. And those modern suppositions are rooted in modern ways of thinking. And so, and this is unavoidable. Sure, when I write about it, I'm doing the same thing, but the first task is to say, well, let's dispense with believing that everyone was a primitive fertility nut, which is how half of it's coined, or let's dispense with their brains were fundamentally different and had not quite evolved. That gets rid of the psychological theory. And let's just assume, so here's my assumption. Let's assume that people in the ancient past are not different than us, not worse than us, not better than us. Let's make the radical assumption that they're just like us.
But just don't have quite as much information at their disposal.
Right, exactly. We've been...
Well, right. So writing changes everything, right? They weren't making cell phones and satellites. You can't do that. You need thousands of layers of vertical information over decades and centuries of literate written text in order for us to get the technology that we have. For tens of thousands of years, that wasn't the case.
Right.
But mind you, probably the greatest invention in human history isn't the iPhone, it's actually writing.
Right.
Writing changes everything, and it turns out oral peoples had to do that. That is an intellectual task that's Herculean in scope, right up there with the minds of Newton and Kepler and Galileo. And people invented writing. We know nothing about them, absolutely nothing. And of course, these are the same people who domesticated crops and animals. Cows just don't appear in nature. You have to breed them into existence. Wheat and corn and barley and basically everything you survive off of had to be created out of a howling wilderness by people who could do it. And that's no small task.
Right, that's true. And the earliest forms of writing don't resemble our phonetic alphabets. That's a yet even later advancement. I think cuneiform and
clearly
maybe there's some others
and,
are hieroglyphs and some others are your earliest forms of writing. Is that would you agree?
That is correct. The earliest forms of writing have one foot still in orality. So you get like Egyptian hieroglyphs. You get all these images, they're pictographs.
Yeah, pictographs, I was going to say.
Of different animals and combinations of animals and humans and symbols. And actually, the more Egyptologists study this, the more they realize that, you know, when the Egyptians put a head of an animal on a person, that symbol represented not just the identity of the animal, but the entire life cycle of that animal. So they had to know the mating, migration, patterns of hundreds and thousands of different species. So this is a very observant, rational mind pouring in their observations into a pictorial writing system, which today, by the way, we still don't understand.
Yeah, if only we could summon one of them, back to do it. But even then, perhaps we'd get their version.
Well, I mean, right. Meaning changed from the first dynasty to the last dynasty of Egypt. In fact, the coffin texts are often, the Book of the Dead often repeats the funerary imagery out of order, upside down, backwards, which tells you that the scribes had no idea what they were doing. So I mean, they themselves, the Egyptians themselves, admitted that they had lost a lot, and so they kept acquiring and accreting all the information they could in an attempt to try to figure out what their ancestors had passed down. But once you rigify an oral tradition in a written system, you end up losing a lot, because the oral tradition involves dance, chanting, rituals, cosmology, star watching. All of that disappears when you invent writing.
Not to mention just the personal influence of the speaker, the storyteller, who's going to add his own flair to it, to every story.
Well, I just had a question on the when it comes to the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the stories of Isis and Horus and Osiris and Anubis and Set. How do if the writing itself, if we can't figure that out 100%, how do we get those stories? How do we know the stories from the coffin text, from the pyramid text, from all the sites?
Oh, that's a good question. The truth of the matter is, our knowledge of Egyptian stories and myths, the story of Osiris and Isis and Horus, are actually pretty late. We get a lot of this from late writers such as Plutarch, who is Greek, and he gives us the Greek version of the Egyptian stories. And most of our versions of myth of Egypt are all Greek. So already we've got a problem. And they're really late accountings. When you look at the pyramid texts, you do see Osiris on the wall all the time, but the pyramid texts are shorthand for rituals that are going on in the funerary cult, and that we do not have access to. So exactly how they were using their narratives and exactly what rituals they were performing and how they conceived that in their cosmology, that can only be speculated upon. And turns out we're quite good at that. It turns out the less you know, the more you can write about it. So we have volumes and volumes of speculation. That's where all these academic theories come from, as different people try to tackle ancient myth and try to figure it out. And of course, that's all we can do. And so that's what we do.
John, would you say that the Rosetta Stone was the one key factor, though?
Well, the Rosetta Stone. Well, let's put it like this: the Rosetta Stone certainly helped translate Egyptian into an understandable grammar and syntax by which we can translate words. But quite frankly, translation implies understanding. So Egyptologists can translate the pyramid texts, but none of them can tell you what they mean. And so the question is, well, then have we translated it?
Good question.
So if I'm getting this right, and among all of the great folks here at the team, I'm one of the least myth literate folk. So let me try to encapsulate this for us. You're saying that our understanding of Egyptian mythology is at best interpolation of partial knowledge. Is that fair to say?
Or the Greek version of what the Greeks are telling us that the Egyptians told us.
Is that fair to say?
That is very fair to say.
Okay, that's great. That's the first time that's ever been put to me personally, and that's fascinating. I guess you have to obviously know that.
Well, look, this is the truth of all ancient.
Clearly, yeah.
All ancient traditions derive from orality. I mean, look at the Bible. The Bible story. Put the Pope on. The Bible derives from oral traditions, and it doesn't get written down till the late 6th, 5th century BCE, and by the time it gets written down, that's just the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. By the time it gets written down, it's being written down by literate priests who have already misunderstood the oral tradition.
Correct.
So we try, we think that people for over 1,000 years can believe the same thing and all put it in one tradition. No one believes the same thing over 1,000 years. Not oral peoples, not literate peoples. I mean, do Americans believe in the same America that Americans believed 200 years ago? No. Do American Christians believe in the same Christianity they believed in 200 years ago?
Not even close.
There are many, many differences, and this is true of all cultures, all religions, all systems. There's an evolution that occurs. So by the time that the literate scribes write down the oral traditions in the Bible, you get a lot of things that change from orality to literacy, from one century to another century, from one culture to another culture. Mind you, the Jewish scribes wrote it down. Had just been in Babylon for a century. So,
Yes.
what kind of accretion is going on there?
The influence of the Persians is absolutely super important. Yep.
And again, this is true of all cultures and all religions. It's true of Buddhism and Hinduism, and this is human culture, and this is what happens. So, but when I say that we really don't know what the Egyptians were doing. I'm not an Egyptologist, and there are probably many Egyptologists out there who would say, "Oh no, we know what they were doing." But I would say not only do we not know what they were doing, but it's a mysterium tremendum that will never really fully resolve, and that's quite frankly true of all oral traditions that have been turned into literate traditions.
He's John Lundwall, PhD. You're listening to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show, an eloquent speaker on mythology itself. And I had an audience with the Pope of Apostasy before the program, and I asked His Highness, I said, Your Holiness, I said, it'll be nice to have a show with a topic on mythology for its own merit, mythology itself, not a mythology or not some of the mythologies or not the way that we as mythicists study mythology, but just mythology. And he's talked to that. And what was the point of where I was going?
But I've agreed to permit this.
Thank you. Yes. He has agreed to permit this. But I wonder, it's how long into the show now, guys? What do we got? 20 minutes in or something? And you have talked to us about mythology as a cultural phenomenon in order to pass down traditions to help societies progress and pass on learned knowledge for the betterment of the group in terms of obvious things like crop planting and whatnot. And you've yet to mention in all that time religion and mythology's obvious connection there. Was there a time when mythology was less related to religion? Are they in fact the same thing? Are they tied together right from the beginning? When did that become a thing, my friend?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's probably worthy of a show itself.
Right. Well, here we are. Here we are.
Here's a huge problem for us modern people looking back in the oral world. It turns out there is not a single ancient culture that has a word for religion as we use our word religion. And if you do not have a word for a thing, you do not have a concept of it. So what's that tell you? The Egyptians, Mesopotamians, the ancient Greeks, the Aborigines of Australia, the Native Americans, they never had a word religion, which means they did not separate, a religious function of society from any other function of society. So one, that's problematic. Two, to answer your question, you're going to get 100 different answers from 100 different academics. In fact, I was just listening to a woman out of the Midwest. I forget which university she teaches at, but she began her lecture by saying, the first thing you have to know about ancient myth is it is not religion, it's stories. And I sat there thinking, well, how does that make sense? Have you read any religious books? All they are stories. And so, mythology, as we would define it in our modern context, is oral religion. But once again, we're back to the problem of there is no word for religion in the ancient culture. So,
nor was there for mythology, I'm imagining, though.
No, that's right. There was no word for mythology either. They never believed that they were telling myths. So, part of the problem is in oral cultures, you derive meaning from concrete manifestations in nature. So in literate society, we can abstract things. So we abstract this idea of religion. We abstract this idea of myth. In ancient cultures, that wasn't going on. They would call a tree a name of a deity so that they could remember the functions of that tree and how that helped them, but they never separated the deity, the tree, and its social consequences or their use of it in their society. It all belonged to the same corpus of knowledge. So the idea of religion as a separate category is actually a modern invention. And
how modern?
I would say it begins in early Christianity. Christianity is the first, this is my assertion, Christianity is the first religious construct that begins in full literacy.
Okay.
And that's why the stories in the New Testament are not mythological. They're historical. You go into oral religious constructs and you get myths. You don't get history. So the Judeo-Christian tradition is a literate tradition, and that's why you get your religion via history. But you go before that, and the religious traditions are oral traditions, and that's why they all come down to us as myths.
Wow, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Christianity responsible for religion itself. Something else to blame on them. Thanks, John, for that, man. That's awesome.
And I think, isn't it also true that there wasn't a word for history as we know it as well, that history is also a more modern word, that you would always mix in myth and stories when you were telling your history, that the concept of getting it exactly accurate is a newer one.
When there is no history, it's hard to do, right? Like when you start on the North Pole, everything's south, right? So when there, at some point there was no history, I guess.
But I mean, like, did they like?
That's an excellent. I talk about this in my book. How do oral peoples create histories? How do you do that? A modern history has thousands of footnotes with, the writer is referencing journals and notes and all kinds of records in order to try to construct a reliable history. Well, in oral societies, you don't have any of that. So how do you create it? Do you create a history? And it turns out they do, but their rules of history making are completely different than our rules. And as a result, we have misunderstood so many of the oral stories that have been repackaged as history through modern literate thinking. So oral peoples will mythologize their history. Literate peoples historicize the myths. Right? So oral peoples mythologize the history. Literate peoples historicize the myths.
So let me ask you this then: is literacy in fact responsible for fundamentalism? Would we not be in this case if there weren't words to read for those people to believe literally? Interesting.
Okay, now, let's see. You're not the Pope of Apostasy.
No,
what's your office?
I'm the Deacon of Doubt, man.
Deacon of Doubt. Okay.
He's about ready to get excommunicated. I can tell you that.
Hey,
I doubt that.
I tell you what. Define fundamentalism for me.
Fundamentalism is kind of a rigid reading of the text that you take it as it is. You try to take the words for where.
I mean it as in biblical literalism, as in Genesis was not a metaphor.
Right, almost like a Scalia interpretation of the Constitution, strict construction.
A Scaliac interpretation.
Right, a religious strict constructionist. How about that?
Okay, so a very literal reading of the
Yes,
text.
a literal interpretation of ancient text, exactly.
Well, if that is the definition of fundamentalism, oral peoples didn't have text, and so, by that definition, they wouldn't be fundamentalists. However,
No, that's what I say. That was my point. Did literacy...
I'm going to augment your
Okay,
definition,
okay.
though.
Right, but what's your definition?
My definition of fundamentalism is when ideology overrides all other concerns, practical, moral, intellectual.
Okay.
So,
I suppose I see that as a consequence of a literal reading of the ancient
so
text.
here's what happens. You go to an oral society like the Aztecs. Were they fundamentalists? Well, let's see. During their new fire rites, they would take a human person, generally of another tribe, probably a contrary political or religious persuasion. They'd take him up on a hill, and they would repeat their creation myth by cutting open his chest, ripping out his heart while it was still beating, putting in a fire stick in his open chest, and starting a fire, out of which they would reignite all the fires in their cities.
But they didn't. They didn't do that in a response to a scientific discovery, which led them to understand that their rituals were in fact not necessary, because the sun was going to do that every year anyway, for real scientific reasons. I guess my thing about the fundamentalism is it's a return to the mythological fundamentalism, which is born of innocence.
But make your point about the Aztecs. So they're doing this, and they're lighting them on fire. But what was kind of finish your point?
My point is they were reenacting very literally every aspect of their creation story, which included their creation god immolating himself to give life to the earth. So they would literally, perform human sacrifices in repetition of their creation story in order to keep the creation going. It's brutal. Is that fundamental? Is that an oral form of fundamentalism?
It is, but my point is that that fundamentalism is born of, that was their best understanding of the science of the day. That was they didn't have a scientist going, wait a minute, you don't need to sacrifice him to ensure that the sun's going to come back in spring, because it's going to come back, because this is where we are in the cosmos. They didn't have that knowledge, so their fundamentalism is born of a different thing. Modern fundamentalism, the return to biblical literalism, when there was a time, at least in my experience, when most religious societies in the Judeo-Christian world had accepted evolution, had accepted geological age, and now suddenly we see in America a return to biblical literalism, which necessitates, I feel it, in their mind, it necessitates or it validates the myth arc by sticking to the literalism of the Garden of Eden story.
Well, based on his definition, like ideology overrides all other concerns. I guess the Aztecs would be fundamentalists if that ideology arose other concerns. So, I mean, tell us, did they sometimes not do this if the War of the Flowers they didn't have enough people? What do you think? Were the Aztecs fundamentalists?
Clearly they were, is I think is the point. Right?
Yeah. This is a modern category, but I wouldn't want to live in. If I had a choice between attending a Christian public school where I was taught a literal interpretation of Genesis, but then I could go home and drink my Mountain Dew and call those guys nuts, or living in an Aztec society where at any moment I could have my heart ripped out, I'd pick the former. So, it's. All cultures eventually, I mean, this is a kind of a sad repetition in history, that all cultures eventually end up in some form of fundamentalism. The decay of culture is a rigidity of a either political or religious ideology, which soon overrides all other practical concerns, and societies will ride that out until they extinguish themselves. And as proof of that, there's no ancient society that exists today. And somehow we think that we have overcome that aspect of human nature because modernity is the triumph of history. But quite frankly, if you turn on the news, I don't think there's a lot of triumph going on right now. So,
well, don't you think every society has felt themselves the they could describe themselves the same way. The modernity is the cure, so it doesn't affect them. Yeah,
that's right. Every society has bought into that egocentric cosmovision that we have finally overcome. Our way is the way that triumphs over history, and then
So are we on the way in modern society? Is that what we're to believe? Are we on the way out, or is it on?
Hey, that's above my pay grade.
Oh, come on, man.
One question, John. Can you formulate for us some major similarities and differences between some of the oral traditions that have existed? I'm thinking back to one of my old professors at Madison, Dr. Harold Schoib. Are you familiar with his work?
I'm not.
Okay, it states that he's one of the leading scholars of African oral traditions in folklore, having walked about 6,000 miles through South Africa, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. If you're familiar with any of those types of oral traditions, are there some highlights that say these are the similarities between oral traditions, and this is what kept them going, whether it be through music or paintings that may be remnant. And at this point, this was a highlight that then created this change in how we viewed oral traditions. Are there any highlights, similarities, differences that you can tell us generally when we look at oral traditions worldwide?
Yes. This brings up a series of problems. There are some mythologies that are universal all around the world, and to this day we still don't know exactly how to explain that. Why is it that the flood myth, which in ancient times wasn't called a myth, is almost universal? You find it in the Americas, Australia, parts of China, all through Europe, Northern Africa. The only place that I'm aware of that flood stories are rather scant are Southern Africa and parts of China. So how do we account for that? And of course, the fundamentalist interpretation is, well, there was a flood, right? And so that's why it's all similar. What's interesting, though, is as you collect these flood stories, one, there's a problem. The stories that we have are really just kind of broken fragments. So, that's problematic to begin with. But here's another thing that just blew my mind is I spent about, just over a year collecting every fragment of flood myth I could find because I was trying to answer a couple questions I had about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the more I collected, the more I was shocked that in almost every flood myth, except for the biblical one, the imagery behind the flood is celestial.
Okay.
So in many Native American flood stories, the flood occurs from the star world, and then it affects the earth in the earth world. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have a variation of that. Gilgamesh has to descend into the underworld, which is, by the way, located in the sky, and he goes to the underworld to discover the secrets of eternal life. And of course, Utnapishtim, who is the only mortal who's been granted eternal life, he goes to Utnapishtim and says, how do I get eternal life? How do I get my friend Enkidu back? And Utnapishtim says, quote, I will tell you a secret from the gods, end quote. And he tells him the flood story. And of course, that makes no sense. And to this day, almost all of academia says, well, it doesn't make sense, and therefore the story was inserted as an after the fact, as a ad hoc addition. Here they had this flood story. They had no idea what to do with it, so they just insert it into the Epic of Gilgamesh at this point. That's the current leading theory. But when you turn to chapter 175 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you find a need descending into the underworld to gain the secrets of immortality. And the sun god Ra tells a flood story. So So obviously something more is going on with this flood tradition than a worldwide geologic flood. And in the West Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere, it's full of celestial themes. It's full of themes of rebirth. And of course, almost all flood stories are told in conjunction with the creation stories. And actually, if you read the Genesis account, the Noah flood story is almost a photocopy of Genesis
Right.
1. So even there, that tradition survives. And so what you have here then is a series of similarities all around the globe that would have us interpret the flood myth as completely other than the way we've always interpreted it. That's just one example. I'm co-authoring a paper right now with a Roman Catholic. You might be interested in this guy. He's an archaeologist, and he wanted to write a paper on the celestial background of some of the motifs in the New Testament, and I was quite skeptical of it. But as we go through some of the sources, the similarities between Mesopotamia and Egypt and ancient Greece in their cult of rebirth are stunning, and it's easy to make connections into the early Christian world from there. How that transition occurs, you're going to get all kinds of scholars saying different things. So to speak to your question, are there similarities? There's similarities all over. One of the problems with comparative myth studies, we always get accused of just piling on the similarities and without looking at the differences. And that is true traditionally. So what you have to do is you look at the similarities first, and then you look at the differences, and you see what the differences tell you about each individual culture. And so it turns out there are also a lot of differences between these stories as well as similarities. So
Could it be that agriculture develops kind of simultaneously or in different points at different places throughout the world? I mean, could the flood myth tie into agriculture, and that when they finally develop crops that are going to grow in the same place, that you in fact need the river to flood in order to do this? Could it simply be a practical way of remembering some of this stuff?
Well, I think so. In fact, I write in my book, Mythos and Cosmos, that we can explain some of the similarities of world myths all around the world simply because they were basing them off of celestial cycles, which turn out to be the same no matter where you are at on the planet, as long as you're north of the equator.
Interesting.
So if a certain star or star cluster like the Pleiades rises during the harvest season or the planting season, then you as an oral society are going to create a myth, a ritual that ties that star into that growing cycle. And sure enough, as you look around the world, that's exactly what has happened. And so the similarities in myths can be tied to these celestial cycles which have terrestrial manifestations.
Okay. So really it's about life and how to kind of scratch out a living in a tough world, and maybe not so much like mnemonics. One of my initial theories that I was going to ask, but I probably have rejected it, was, my very eager mother just serves nachos. Doesn't mean anything about my mother, but rather as a way to remember the planets, in order. Were they doing it just
That's a new one on me. I'd learned a
to
different one.
remember stuff, or really maybe it's more practical? What do you think? I mean, are these just all practical ways of this is how we live?
No. One, it has to be practical. Really, the ancient world is, summed up in 3 words by Tacitus: toil, toil, toil. So you have to. It's subsistence farming for the most of it, so it has to be practical. But it turns out there is a highly developed metaphysic and cosmology behind all these myths that we still don't quite understand because it's oral. But are the pyramid texts practical?
I guess you're right.
Do you build this mammoth structure that is so perfect in its alignments, out of practicality, I don't think so. There is a metaphysical cosmovision that drives all these civilizations, and not just Egypt building their huge pyramids. I have this YouTube video. I think that's how you discovered me, about the Lakota in North America, who during the spring season would break their spring camp. And in all our history books, we were told that, they were kind of hunter-gatherers. They followed the herds and the game as they traveled through central North America. But that's not what they were doing. They broke their camp at spring equinox, and as the sun moved through the Lakota constellations, they would arrive at a different camp in the Black Hills that corresponded with those constellations. In other words, the Lakota were not just randomly following the herds, they were reenacting a celestial journey on the ground.
Wow.
So that from their spring camp to their summer camp, from spring equinox to summer solstice, they moved from camp to camp, each camp representing a different star, until they arrived at Devil's Mountain, where they performed their summer solstice ritual. This is it's universal. We find this kind of patterning all over the ancient world, everywhere. And two, it tells us that one, there is practicality to it. How are you going to, memorize all the stars and all the seasons and all the correspondences you need to know in order to know when to plant, when to follow this kind of game, when to do this? Well, you ritually act it out. So there is a very practical side to it, but there is also a stunning theology behind it. The Lakota, like most Native American tribes, believe their ancestors came from the star world, that they originated in the star world, that the land of the grandfathers is in the star world, that they would return to the star world. And in order to return to the star world, they had to make a celestial journey, which was dangerous. And what better way to learn that journey than to enact it in a yearly rite on the ground?
It sounds like there's another word, superstition, that we haven't really talked about, that sort of is at the beginning of these things, right? Is it the metaphysical that you're talking about? And a poker player might do the same thing. He needs to enter his seat from the same side, or wear the same dirty socks every. We still do that. We don't give it a second thought. But even it's safe to say, even atheists have those little, supers that are just a fundamental bit of our psychology there. They can't really avoid.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it superstition. I mean, human beings are superstitious. We are by nature very non-rational. I don't know if you've noticed that. But the ancient world was filled with magic and curses, and all these people were doing everything they could to try to manipulate the reality so that they could, live a better life. And we would call that superstition. And quite frankly, literacy put a lot of end to that. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is, Homo sapiens are Homo religiosus. We have embedded in our psyche this will to make meaning of our environment.
Right.
And there are some questions we simply cannot answer. And so we have to create a metaphysic to explain the universe. And so, today we say, well, science can answer all our questions, but I hate to say this, no, it can't. There are basic fundamental questions. All the things that we live on, we have to take for granted. No one understands how the first life appeared in the universe, or how consciousness appeared in the universe. Mm-hmm. All we have is recourse to theories. And so we create value systems based off our theories and our projections. And over time, eventually that creates a sort of religiosity. So I think that we are geared to always create some sort of theological system. You guys may disagree with that, but I'm a huge believer in South Park. I don't know if you saw the episode of Go Cartman Go, when he gets cryo-frozen and he wakes up, 2,300 CE, and the scientist took over the planet, and he wakes up and the whole world is at war because each scientific faction believes they have the one true answer to the ultimate question. and of course, there's talking penguins that are winning the war. So I just think it's human nature that we do these things. And I don't know, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts personally are that it's time to beg the audience for money. It's the Mythos Milwaukee show, and we're having a great talk. It's fascinating stuff, and we could go on, and we will. But we need to do a station break. We are on iTunes and YouTube is where you can find our shows archived. After this, we will, in fact, post it, edit it a little bit, and get rid of some of the idiocy and blunders. As a great engineer Jason Lawson does. But that'll be up on iTunes and YouTube. So please find us and like us there and give us the 5-star rating that we so richly deserve as Deacon and Pope for the day. The Friar of Free Thought probably next week again. But
demotion.
Yeah, for now, please go to our Patreon page as well and pledge your support. So that we can keep on bringing you shows like this with great guests like John Lundwall, PhD. And you know, Brian, that PhD stands for piled higher and deeper, right? You were aware of that, right?
Oh, no, I learn
topic.
New things as the Pope every day.
That's
now I
another
need to make a bowl and figure out how to fit this into the catechism.
That's right. But please, go to Patreon and also go to mythicistmilwaukee.com. And consider a membership that'll help. It's not very expensive, quite affordable, and you can help us do what we do. And part of what we do is bring conferences to the area, and we create videos and movies as well. And Batman and Jesus will be coming out in the near future. Looking forward to seeing the trailer for that soon. There's a shoot. We need extras. If you are in the area at all, please, next Friday, right, the 15th, I want to say go to... what's the name of the church? Calvary Chapel, Calvary Cathedral,
That's
or
right.
whatever it is, who has very kindly offered their location for us to film Batman and Jesus trailer. Batman and Jesus, an exploration of modern mythology and how the stories of today reflect the evolving mythologies of those we're more familiar with in the religious world, such as the Judeo-Christian myth arc and Jesus himself. We are
April 15th
April
and
15th
10th in Wisconsin.
10th in Wisconsin. Very
If
good.
you're local.
Nice work. If you're local, get out there. But it's time for a little thing we like to call Myth of the Day. And Antonio has been waiting patiently with his Myth of the Day because of the talk. And it's time now. So take it away, Antonio.
Thank you again, Dr. John Lundwall of PhD of Mythological Studies. You've been very popular today on Twitter. We have a number of retweets and likes that I'd like to share real quick before I give the Myth of the Day. Megan Ivanos, the Kryptonian, Miguel Connor, who was our moderator at our last debate, Gateway to Reason, Godless Engineer, The Green Room, and Satiristas also retweeted. Ellen McCall out of Africa, Helmo, Free Thought Alliance, and Laura Nigro. The Virgin Mary is the constellation Virgo, also known as Virgo the Virgin. Virgo is also referred to as the house of bread, and the representation of Virgo is a virgin holding a sheaf of wheat. This house of bread and its symbol of wheat represent August and September, the time of harvest. In turn, Bethlehem is in fact literally translated into house of bread. Bethlehem is thus a reference to the constellation Virgo, a place in the sky, not on earth. And the identification of a virgin mother with the constellation of Virgo is common in history. For example, we have already seen through our works and our research that the Egyptian goddess Isis is a virgin mother, as are Neith and several other mythological figures. Virgo, who now lends her name to this sign of the zodiac, is the heavenly nut, the virgin mother of Osiris, who was called the perfect one and the ancient one, and symbolized light and goodness according to harmony, peace, and happiness. This virgin, the great mother, the queen of heaven, the inscrutable Neith, whose veil no mortal could life and live. From Mr. Schmidt. That is our Myth of the Day.
Thank you, Antonio. Myth of the Day brought to you by Kenosha Racine Atheists and Free Thinkers. Activism in Southeast Wisconsin. We're talking to John Lundwall today on the Mythos Milwaukee show. And John, you're not going to get a pass on telling us a little bit about yourself, even though your topic is so fascinating. we could ignore that. But we do usually ask the tough questions. You have a waspy name, and you're a scholarly guy, and you've been talking researchingly about your knowledge. Please tell us, where you're from. What was your religious background? You went to BYU. We can't help notice that. You got a Scandinavian last name. What's your story, man?
All true. My ancestors are from Sweden, and I grew up Mormon, and went to BYU, and
you win a national championship while you were there?
A national championship for
in what?
In football. Jim McMahon and crew.
Actually, the national championship was with Steve Young.
Oh,
wasn't it?
yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, you would have missed that trivia.
My bad. Yeah, I was told that last night, but I was, I had too much papal wine and I goofed it up.
So you were raised.
Let's edit that.
I wasn't at BYU for the national championship. So, and sadly, BYU's football team currently is, in the underworld. So, it's hard watching. Let's see. I'm I've studied religions all my life. I can tell you how I got interested in this. As a young kid, I read my own book of scripture, and I thought, wow, that was so interesting. I want to read every book of scripture of every world religion. So I set myself a goal to do that. It's ridiculous, of course. There's so much. But over 20, 30 years, I've put a good dent in doing that. And, finally I said, I'm going to make this official. So I went to graduate school where I could, codify my learning piled high and deep. And
see that? He knows.
There is some truth to that. And so that, that's just my personal interest. I can also tell you in my studies, I was finding so much cosmological motifs that I realized, unlike all the theorists I was reading, I'd have to go out and learn the sky, which was a very daunting task. So I started out by making a homemade telescope, including all the mirrors, by hand.
No.
Galileo style.
Grinding mirrors.
Grind the mirrors and make the measurements and build the scope. And so I've turned into a kind of an amateur astronomer, and I give presentations on astronomy quite often through the summers. So that certainly has helped my studies. So,
are you still a Mormon, or did you have to come out of that at some point? And did you have a different awakening, or are you still a faithful Mormon? Or?
Oh, I'm still a faithful Mormon. How many faithful Mormons have you had on your show, Mr. Pope of Apostles?
Wow,
Brian's the Pope. No, maybe one. I think, honestly,
I don't know if we've had. We may have, but I doubt. Would you say that you're a mythicist, or would you if you had to use the label, what would you use?
Well, look, gentlemen, I'm three things. One, I'm a man of faith. Two, I'm a pluralist. And three, I am a scholar. Mm-hmm. And, there are some tensions between those three things. There are plenty of people in my faith who are far too literalists for the scriptures for me. Mm-hmm. But you'd be surprised how many are not. So I can't speak to your understanding of that, but I tackle this text in two ways. Scholarly, where I deconstruct it and try to find the historical context and what that construction may mean. And when I first started, it was a series of blows to my traditional faith that I had been taught. And but in the end, I thought, well, of course, more truth is better. And so this is a baptism out of sort of this childlike universe into something that, for me personally, enriched my faith, not destroyed it. I spent a lot of time explaining to many people in my community how the Bible got to be where it is, and how our interpretations of it for centuries have been, a modern pastoral retake that has little to do with the historical context, if anything at all. And, there's some dangers in doing that. And so...
You can window into your own philosophy maybe at cosmosandlogos.com, where you have a blog. There's some well-written stuff on there. I've scanned through it. And maybe even a poem or two. Is that correct?
Yeah. A poem or two.
No, these are pretty good. Yeah. Do you mind if I read Whitman's Repose in a minute?
You bet.
It's about 59 minutes in. We're going to go over and lose the live audience just to let everybody know the show cuts off at an hour, but the entirety of our conversation and visit will be recorded and available on the archive afterwards. So when you lose us live listeners, you can listen to the end later. And this is Whitman's Repose by John Lundwall. A noiseless, patient spider, I marked, where on a little promontory it stood, isolated. Marked how, to explore the vacant, vast surrounding, it launched forth filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. It's a nice poem. It's got some good stuff in there, and I'm sorry I messed up a couple words. I just read it for the first time a minute ago, and thought
this is my literature background.
Yeah, right. No, I really enjoy it. And you're
right. Since I'm the Pope, I'm going to send this down to the smart people and tell them to figure out what that means. Right.
Okay. Yeah, you do that, and let us know after your council results. So what else do you? Where do we find your book? You've written a book. Tell us what it's called, where to find it, how people can help John Lundwall.
Well, the book is called Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. You can buy it on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. And it is I have a whole section. My last chapter talks about the Bible and what we've done to it and from whence it came. And as I go through several different myths, including Hieroglyphs and Gilgamesh, and show the cosmological and cultic background behind them. So there's a lot of stuff that I talk about. It's basically about oral cultures and how they created myths and why they created myths. And I am outside of the standard academic explanation of the fertility cults and the psychological school of theory. So I root it all in oral cognition and oral cosmology. And that's my field of study and what I thoroughly enjoy doing. So it's a book that is, I try to write it for the average educated person. I don't know if I succeeded, but it should be, if you're interested in ancient myth and religion, then it's a book you'd probably be interested in.
Well, tell us about mid-level ancient, near ancient, or actually fairly modern mythology. How does it relate, in fact, to Mormonism, a 17th or 18th century?
19th, I believe.
I think it was late 1700s, wasn't it? When
Joseph Smith is active in the early 1800s.
Ask the Mormon. How does mythology relate to Mormonism?
1830 was the start of the Mormon Church, and Joseph Smith's take on Christianity is I'm going to get in trouble with a lot of my Mormon neighbors here, but it's essentially Gnostic. He walks out and says, "Okay, Orthodox Christianity, I'm going to repackage and reformulate the entire cosmovision," and he did. And personally, I think that's genius. I have no interest in a literal, inerrant Bible in a Protestant paradigm. And of course, Mormonism has some, interesting, outsiders would call it nuts. But it is a very expansive view of the material universe, which personally speaks to me. So I like how Joseph Smith was open-ended on everything. Of course, as time goes, tradition and culture tries to close all those open ends in a more orthodox, rigid system, which I am constantly fighting against. But the Mormonism is a sort of Gnostic reformulation of early 19th century Christianity, with one foot still firmly in early 19th century Christianity. So you do get some contradictions and some tensions that are born out of that and play out through Mormon history, and for good and for bad. So I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was perfect.
so.
Anybody got anything else to add?
Well, I would say you're definitely a man of faith that says to be skeptical of fundamentalism. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, I am as much a non-fundamentalist as there is. Look, gentlemen, I think we live in an age of fundamentalism, but I do not ascribe fundamentalism only to the religious right, where it certainly exists. Fundamentalism is any system of belief that basically creates an ideological bureaucracy to sustain itself at all costs.
Right.
And if you walk onto almost any academic campus, holy crap, you will find an enormous amount of fundamentalism on the academic left. And it's sad because you've got that on the left, you've got the religious fundamentalism on the right, and I can say that I am a political atheist. Maybe I can relate to you guys through that.
Very good.
Because it's I find that we live in a time where we've got the politicization of cultural views that has turned into fundamental ideologies, and that.
Whether they're religious or not, you can have a fundamental ideology.
Yeah, I think religious people who think that way are among our best allies, I think, as we move forward with our secular concerns.
The Venn diagram overlaps here.
Yeah. Great job, John Lundwall. Thanks for joining us.
You bet.
Keep in touch.
Thanks for having me.
Keep in touch. We'll send you the link when it's out.
I'd love to.
All right, take it easy.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
It's been the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of myself, Rob Moore, and my co-host, Brian Edward, Mythmeister Antonio, engineer Jason Lawson, and producer, the Mexican Bohawk himself, with the Irish name Sean Frasek. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Who's the guest next week? Does anybody know? Come on, research team. We'll be back again on Sunday at 2 o'clock for another edition of the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Thanks again for joining us, everybody, and take it easy. Bye.
Very good.
And who